The morning sun cast long shadows across the remote hiking trail in the Colorado Rockies as Sarah Chun adjusted her backpack straps and checked her GPS one final time. She had planned this solo hiking trip for months, needing the solitude after completing her final deployment with the Navy SEALs. At 28, she was one of the few women to have earned the coveted trident, and the mental weight of her service demanded this kind of peaceful retreat. Sarah moved through the wilderness with the practiced silence that had kept her alive through countless operations in hostile territories. Her civilian clothes couldn't hide the way she carried herself, the constant awareness, the measured steps that made no unnecessary sound, the eyes that never stopped scanning for threats. Even in retirement, some habits were impossible to break. The trail wound through dense pine forests and rocky outcroppings, leading deeper into the backcountry where cell service disappeared, and the only sounds came from wind through branches and distant bird calls. Sarah had deliberately chosen this remote route, wanting complete isolation from the world she was trying to leave behind. She carried minimal gear, just enough food and water for a 3-day trek, a lightweight tent, and the tactical knife she never traveled without. 3 hours into her hike, Sarah noticed the first sign something was wrong. Boot prints in the soft earth beside the trail, fresh ones that hadn't been there when she'd scouted this route online. The prints were heavy, made by someone carrying significant weight, and they were following her path. More concerning was that they showed deliberate spacing, the kind made by someone trying to move quietly through terrain. Sarah's training kicked in automatically. She stepped off the main trail, using a fallen log to mask her footprints, and began moving parallel to the path while staying hidden in the tree line. Her breathing remained steady, her heartbeat controlled, as she activated the mental protocols that had kept her alive through urban combat in Syria and reconnaissance missions along hostile coastlines. The sounds reached her 15 minutes later, voices attempting to be quiet, but carrying further than their owners realized in the thin mountain air. Sarah counted at least 4 distinct speakers, all male, discussing search patterns and coordination points. The terms they used were military, but not quite right, like civilians who had learned tactical language from movies and online forums rather than actual service. Sarah found a position behind a cluster of granite boulders where she could observe the trail without being seen. When the 4 men came into view, her assessment was immediate and thorough. They were armed with hunting rifles and handguns, dressed in mismatched camouflage, and moving with the overconfident swagger of people who thought they were predators. The largest of the group, a bearded man in his 40s wearing military-style gear that had never seen actual military service, was clearly their leader. "She came this way," the leader said, pointing at Sarah's original footprints. "City girl probably doesn't know these woods at all. We'll have her cornered by nightfall." "What's the plan when we catch up to her?" asked a younger man with nervous energy and badly maintained equipment. "Same as always," the leader replied with a grin that made Sarah's jaw tighten. "Take what we want, leave no witnesses. These solo hikers make it too easy." Sarah remained perfectly still as the men passed her position, continuing up the trail in pursuit of prey they thought was helplessly ahead of them. She counted their weapons, assessed their physical condition, and noted the way they moved through terrain. They were dangerous to ordinary hikers, but they had no idea what kind of hunter had just become the hunted. When the voices faded, Sarah began moving through the forest with purpose. She paralleled the group's route while staying completely invisible, using skills honed through years of tracking high-value targets in environments far more challenging than Colorado wilderness. Every step was calculated, every movement designed to gather intelligence while remaining undetected. The group made camp as evening approached, choosing a clearing beside a stream about 2 miles from where they'd first picked up Sarah's trail. They built a fire despite the tactical disadvantage it created, posted no guards, and spoke loudly about their previous victims. Sarah listened from a concealed position 50 meters away, gathering evidence of crimes that would never see courtrooms. "Remember that couple last month?" one of them was saying. "Thought they were so smart with their GPS and satellite communicator. Fat lot of good it did them when we jammed the signal. This one's traveling alone," the leader added, cleaning his rifle with obvious satisfaction. "Probably some stressed-out office worker thinking she can find herself in nature." They always think they're safe out here, away from city crime. Don't realize there are worse things than muggers in these mountains. Sarah had heard enough. She withdrew to a position half a mile away where she could plan without risk of detection. The men had revealed themselves as serial predators who hunted hikers for sport and profit. They had equipment to jam communications, weapons to threaten victims, and enough experience to have killed before. Most importantly, they had chosen the wrong target this time. As darkness settled over the wilderness, Sarah began her preparations. She removed the tactical knife from her pack and checked its edge, still razor sharp. From her first aid kit, she retrieved items that could serve multiple purposes. Her hiking boots were replaced with lightweight approach shoes that would make no sound on rock or forest floor. Every piece of gear was chosen for utility in what was about to become a very different kind of hunt. Sarah moved through the night like a ghost, using techniques learned in urban warfare and perfected through operations where discovery meant death. She approached the group's camp from downwind, staying low and using natural cover to remain invisible. The four men had made every mistake possible: bright fire, loud conversation, no perimeter security, and weapons stacked carelessly while they drank and celebrated crimes they thought were still secret. The first man never saw her coming. Sarah appeared beside him like materialized darkness, one hand covering his mouth while the other applied pressure to a nerve cluster that dropped him unconscious in seconds. She dragged him away from the firelight and secured him with rope from his own pack, leaving him alive but helpless in a ravine where his companions wouldn't find him until morning. The second man discovered his friend was missing when he went to relieve himself away from camp. Sarah allowed him to call out once, drawing the attention of the remaining two, before she struck. The man found himself face down in pine needles with a knee in his back and cold steel at his throat before he could draw the pistol at his belt. "Make a sound and you die," Sarah whispered, her voice carrying the absolute certainty of someone who had delivered that promise before. "Your friends are about to learn what happens when predators meet an apex predator." The man tried to struggle until Sarah applied pressure that made his vision blur and his body go limp. She secured him beside his unconscious companion, both men tied and gagged but breathing. Sarah had decided these criminals would face justice, not summary execution, though they had shown no such mercy to their previous victims. The leader and his remaining partner had heard their companion's initial shout and were now standing beside their fire, weapons ready, scanning the darkness beyond the light. They called their missing men's names, but received only silence. The forest had swallowed two armed adults without explanation, leaving only shadows that seemed to shift and move independently. "Something's wrong here," the younger man said, his voice tight with growing fear. "Maybe we should call this off, head back to the vehicles." "We don't run from lone hikers," the leader snapped, but Sarah could hear uncertainty creeping into his voice. "Probably just animals spooked them. We finish what we started." Sarah smiled in the darkness. These men had spent so much time being predators that they had forgotten what it felt like to be prey. They were about to receive a comprehensive education in the difference between hunting defenseless civilians and facing someone who had been trained by the world's most elite military unit to turn any environment into a battlefield. The psychological warfare began with sounds, branches breaking in patterns that suggested movement, rocks falling from positions where no rocks should fall, and whispers just at the edge of hearing that could have been wind or could have been something far more dangerous. Sarah moved around the camp in a wide circle, creating the impression of multiple threats closing in from all directions. "There!" the younger man shouted, pointing his rifle at shadows that revealed nothing when illuminated by their flashlight beams. Something moved behind those trees. "Calm down," the leader ordered, but his own weapon was now raised and ready. "It's just our imagination. Nobody could take out two armed men without us hearing something." Sarah's voice came from the darkness beyond the firelight, calm and conversational despite being directed at armed criminals who had murdered innocent people. "Your friends are alive. They're secured and waiting for law enforcement. You have one chance to surrender peacefully." Both men spun toward the sound, weapons tracking, but Sarah was no longer in that position. Her voice had been a deliberate misdirection while she moved to a spot that offered tactical advantage and multiple escape routes. The men fired wildly into the forest, muzzle flashes destroying their night vision and revealing their exact positions, while Sarah remained invisible in the darkness she had learned to use as camouflage. "Who are you?" the leader shouted, his earlier confidence replaced by growing desperation. "What do you want?" "Justice for your victims," Sarah replied from a completely different position, her voice carrying the kind of authority that came from leading soldiers through life and death situations. "And an end to your hunting expeditions." The psychological pressure was deliberate and calculated. Sarah had learned in counter-terrorism operations that fear was often more effective than violence at breaking enemy morale. These men had relied on terrorizing defenseless victims, but they had no experience dealing with someone who could turn their own tactics against them. The younger man broke first, dropping his weapon and calling out, "I surrender. Don't hurt me. I'll tell you everything." "Shut up," the leader snapped, but his partner was already walking toward the sound of Sarah's voice with his hands raised. The man stumbled through the darkness, away from the fire, desperately seeking the mercy he had never shown his own victims. Sarah emerged from concealment long enough to secure the surrendering criminal with the same efficiency she had shown with his companions. Zip ties from his own gear secured his wrists while medical tape silenced his voice. She left him conscious, but helpless, another problem solved without lethal force. Now only the leader remained, alone beside a fire that had become a liability rather than comfort. His weapon swept back and forth as he tried to track movement in the shadows. But Sarah had become part of the landscape itself. Every skill learned through the most demanding military training in the world was now focused on a single objective: ending the threat these men posed to innocent people. "It's over," Sarah called from the darkness. "Your entire group is secured. Drop your weapons, and this ends peacefully." "I know who you are now," the leader replied, his voice carrying new understanding and deeper fear. "You're military. Special operations. I should have known when I saw how you moved through terrain." "Former military," Sarah corrected, beginning the final phase of an operation that would end with all 4 criminals in custody. "But some training never leaves you." The leader's response was exactly what Sarah had expected from a predator who had finally encountered something more dangerous than himself. Instead of surrendering, he made the mistake that would define the rest of his very short criminal career. He ran into the forest, abandoning his weapons and gear in a desperate attempt to escape justice that had been too long delayed. Sarah gave him a 30-second head start before beginning per 3 months after the Colorado incident. Sarah thought she had left that world behind forever. She was working as a wilderness survival instructor at a private academy in Montana, teaching corporate executives and adventure seekers how to navigate dangerous terrain. The irony wasn't lost on her that she was now helping civilians avoid the kind of predators she had encountered in the mountains, though her students had no idea about her real background. The academy sat on thousands of acres of pristine wilderness, offering everything from basic hiking skills to advanced survival courses. Sarah's classes were always overbooked because word had spread about the mysterious instructor who could teach people to move through terrain like ghosts and spot dangers that others missed completely. She never mentioned her military background, preferring to let people assume she was just naturally gifted at outdoor skills. On a crisp October morning, Sarah was leading a group of 12 students through advanced tracking exercises when her satellite phone buzzed with an emergency signal. The device was supposed to be for wilderness emergencies only, but the message that appeared made her blood run cold with recognition. Federal agents had arrested the 4 men from Colorado, but their investigation had uncovered something much larger. The group had been part of a network that operated across multiple states, using wilderness areas to hunt and kill solo travelers. Dozens of missing persons cases were being reopened, and the surviving criminals were providing information about other cells in exchange for reduced sentences. More importantly for Sarah's immediate situation, one of those cells had just been spotted in the area around her academy. Intelligence suggested they were planning to target students from her survival courses, seeing them as perfect victims, people who would venture into remote areas with expensive gear and limited backup. Sarah read the message twice before deleting it, her mind already shifting into operational planning mode. She looked at her current group of students, a mix of business executives, college students, and outdoor enthusiasts who had no idea they might be walking into a hunting ground prepared by human predators. The nearest law enforcement was hours away, and her students were already committed to a 3-day backcountry exercise. Change of plans, Sarah announced to her group, her voice carrying new authority that made everyone stop what they were doing immediately. We're going to practice evasion techniques. Real-world scenarios where staying hidden could save your life. The students exchanged excited glances, thinking this was part of their adventure experience. They had no idea their instructor had just received intelligence that actual predators were operating in their area, hunting people exactly like them. Sarah began moving the group along routes that avoided obvious trails and camping spots, using terrain features to mask their movement while teaching genuine tactical skills disguised as wilderness education. She showed them how to step on rocks to avoid leaving tracks, how to use natural camouflage to become invisible, and how to read the forest for signs of human presence. "Why are we learning military stuff?" asked Jason, a software developer from Seattle who had signed up thinking he would learn basic camping skills. "I thought this was survival training." "Survival means dealing with all threats," Sarah replied, scanning the tree line for movement while maintaining her instructor persona. "Animals aren't the only dangerous things in the wilderness. Sometimes the most dangerous predator walks on 2 legs." The lesson proved prophetic when Sarah spotted the first sign of human pursuit around midday. Fresh boot prints crossing their path, too recent to have been made by other hikers, and showing the deliberate spacing of people trying to move quietly. Sarah recognized the pattern immediately, a search formation designed to cover ground while maintaining contact between team members. Sarah changed direction without explaining why, leading her students deeper into terrain that would be difficult for pursuers to navigate while offering multiple escape routes. She began teaching advanced concealment techniques, showing her group how to hide in plain sight using natural materials and body positioning that made them blend with the landscape. "This is getting kind of intense," whispered Maria, a college student who was beginning to sense that their exercise had become something more serious. "Are we actually hiding from something real?" Sarah's response was interrupted by the sound of voices in the distance, men calling to each other in the kind of tactical coordination she had heard before. Her students couldn't interpret the significance, but Sarah recognized immediately that they were being hunted by multiple individuals who were experienced at tracking people through wilderness. "New lesson," Sarah said quietly, her voice carrying the kind of authority that made everyone listen without question. "Sometimes survival means staying absolutely quiet and following instructions without debate. Right now, we practice being invisible." Sarah positioned her group in a natural depression surrounded by fallen logs and thick undergrowth. She showed them how to use mud and vegetation to break up the outline of their faces and hands, transforming them from obvious human shapes into indistinct parts of the landscape. The students followed her instructions with growing understanding that this was no longer a simulation. The hunters passed within 20 meters of the hidden group, close enough that Sarah could hear individual conversations and assess their weapons and equipment. For men in military-style gear, carrying rifles and moving in formation, discussing search patterns and kill zones with the casual efficiency of experienced predators. "They went this way," one of the hunters was saying, following the false trail Sarah had deliberately created to lead them away from her students. "Probably trying to reach the main trail back to the academy." "Perfect," replied their leader, a thin man with cold eyes who moved through terrain with professional competence. "We'll set up a crossfire position at the bridge. No way they can avoid us there." Sarah waited until the voices faded before moving her students to a more secure position. The hunters had revealed their plan: establish an ambush at the only bridge across a river that separated this section of wilderness from the academy grounds. Anyone trying to return by the obvious route would walk directly into a prepared killing field. "What's happening?" Jason whispered, finally, understanding that their situation had become genuinely dangerous. "Who were those men?" "People who hunt other people for sport," Sarah replied honestly, deciding her students deserved to know what they were facing. "They've been tracking groups like ours, using wilderness areas where law enforcement response is limited." The revelation created exactly the fear Sarah had expected, but also determination. Her students looked to her for leadership with absolute trust, recognizing that their survival instructor possessed knowledge and skills that went far beyond normal wilderness training. They began following her directions with military precision, moving when she moved and stopping when she signaled danger. Sarah led them through terrain that avoided all obvious routes, while maintaining distance from the hunters who were positioning themselves for ambush. She used skills learned in urban warfare to navigate wilderness that became increasingly challenging, keeping her group together while staying ahead of pursuit that was becoming more organized and systematic. The hunters had made one critical mistake in their planning. They assumed they were tracking ordinary civilians who would panic when threatened and make predictable choices about escape routes. They had no idea they were hunting someone who had been trained to turn pursuit situations into hunter versus hunted scenarios where the original predators became the prey. As afternoon shadows lengthened, Sarah made a decision that would transform their survival exercise into something much more direct. She positioned her students in a secure area with clear instructions about remaining hidden and silent, then began moving back toward the hunters who thought they were controlling the situation. "Stay here and don't move until I return," Sarah told her group, her voice carrying absolute authority. "If anyone other than me approaches, use the emergency beacon to signal for help and follow the escape route I showed you." "Where are you going?" Maria asked, though the answer was becoming obvious from Sarah's preparations. "To make sure these predators don't hurt anyone else," Sarah replied, checking the tactical knife that had served her well in Colorado. Some problems required direct solutions. Sarah moved through the forest like a force of nature, using every skill learned through years of special operations to approach enemies who had no idea they were about to become targets themselves. She located the hunter's position at the bridge choke point, studying their setup and identifying weaknesses that could be exploited. The hunters had arranged themselves in overlapping fields of fire that would catch anyone approaching from the expected direction. They had good cover, clear sight lines, and communication between positions. Against ordinary hikers, their ambush would have been devastatingly effective. Against someone with Sarah's training and experience, it was a textbook example of how static positions could become death traps for the occupiers. Sarah began with psychological warfare, using techniques that had proven effective against the Colorado group. She created sounds that suggested movement from multiple directions, dropped rocks to simulate approaches that weren't real, and made the hunters question whether they were facing one person or several. "Something's moving in the tree line," one of the hunters reported over their radio, scanning terrain that revealed nothing when examined closely. "Hold position," their leader replied, but Sarah could hear uncertainty entering his voice. "Could be animals." Sarah's voice came from the forest beyond their sight, calm and conversational despite being directed at armed criminals preparing to murder innocent people. "Your ambush position has been compromised. Surrender your weapons, and nobody gets hurt." The response was exactly what Sarah had expected: immediate gunfire directed at the source of her voice while she was already moving to a different position. The hunters revealed their locations and capabilities while hitting nothing but trees and shadows. Sarah gathered intelligence about their weapons, ammunition, and tactical discipline while remaining completely invisible. "Military training," the leader said after the shooting stopped, recognition changing his tactical approach. "Probably the survival instructor." Intel said she might have law enforcement background. Sarah smiled in the darkness at their underestimation. Law enforcement training was comprehensive, but it wasn't designed for the kind of direct action that Navy SEAL teams specialized in. These hunters were about to learn the difference between civilian tactical training and military special operations capabilities. The first hunter never saw Sarah coming. She approached from his blind spot during a moment when his attention was focused on distant movement that wasn't real. The man found himself disarmed and unconscious before he could alert his companions, secured with his own equipment, and left alive but helpless among the rocks where he had planned to kill innocent people. The second hunter realized something was wrong when his teammates stopped responding to radio calls. He abandoned his position to investigate, moving through terrain with the overconfidence of someone who thought he was dealing with frightened civilians. Sarah allowed him to find his unconscious companion before striking. demonstrating that armed criminals could disappear just as easily as their intended victims. Two hunters remained at the bridge, now aware they were facing someone with capabilities that exceeded their experience. They called for their missing teammates while repositioning to defend against attacks from any direction. Fear was replacing confidence as they realized their carefully planned ambush had become a nightmare where they were the targets. Professional operator, the leader said into his radio, trying to coordinate with teammates who would never answer. Military special operations, possibly SEAL team background. We need extraction immediately. Sarah's reply came from the darkness around their position, her voice carrying the kind of authority that came from leading soldiers through combat operations. Your extraction was canceled. Your teammates are secured and waiting for law enforcement. This ends when you surrender. The remaining hunters made the mistake that sealed their fate. Instead of surrendering to someone who had demonstrated superior tactical capabilities, they attempted to escape by abandoning their position and fleeing into wilderness where they thought their local knowledge would provide advantage. Sarah gave them a head start before beginning pursuit that demonstrated the difference between criminals who used terrain for cover and someone who had been trained to treat any environment as a battlefield. The hunters crashed through undergrowth like panicked animals, while Sarah moved through the same forest like flowing water, maintaining contact while remaining invisible. The chase ended when the fleeing criminals became separated in darkness and difficult terrain. Sarah took them one at a time, using non-lethal techniques that left them conscious but helpless, secured, and waiting for law enforcement that would arrive with evidence of multiple crimes committed across several states. When Sarah returned to her students, she found them exactly where she had left them, hidden and silent in their concealment position. They emerged from the forest floor like ghosts, having learned camouflage techniques that would serve them well in any survival situation. More importantly, they had learned that real survival sometimes meant facing human predators with the same determination used against natural dangers. Is it over? Jason asked, though the answer was obvious from Sarah's relaxed demeanor. It's over, Sarah confirmed, already composing the report that would connect another cell of wilderness hunters to law enforcement agencies investigating a nationwide pattern of crimes. You can add surviving human predators to your wilderness skills resume. The students looked at their instructor with new understanding. 6 months into her unofficial war against wilderness predators, Sarah received the case that would define everything that followed. Federal agents had identified the largest network yet discovered, a coordinated organization operating across 7 states, with leadership that included former military personnel and sophisticated equipment that suggested significant financial backing. The network had adapted to law enforcement pressure by becoming more careful about target selection and operational security. They now focused on international hikers whose disappearances would receive less media attention, used encrypted communications that were difficult to intercept, and employed counter-surveillance techniques that made them nearly impossible to track through conventional methods. Sarah was contacted through encrypted channels by Agent Maria Santos, a federal investigator who had been following the cases since Colorado. Santos had recognized patterns in the takedowns that suggested someone with special operations background was eliminating cells faster than law enforcement could identify them. The official investigation needed unofficial assistance from someone who could operate in ways that federal agents couldn't. We've identified their main base of operations, Santos explained during a secure satellite conversation. Remote compound in northern Idaho, heavily fortified, with at least 20 operatives. They're planning something called the Great Hunt, a week-long event where paying clients can hunt human targets for sport. Sarah felt ice form in her stomach at the description. These weren't opportunistic criminals preying on random hikers anymore. This was organized murder being marketed to wealthy psychopaths who could afford to pay for the ultimate hunting experience. Innocent people were going to be released into wilderness and hunted for entertainment by customers who had paid substantial amounts for the privilege of killing human beings. Timeline? Sarah asked, already beginning operational planning. 3 weeks, Santos replied. We're trying to coordinate a federal response, but the compound is on private property in a jurisdiction where local law enforcement has been compromised. By the time we can organize a legal operation, dozens of people could be dead. Sarah understood immediately. Federal agencies were constrained by legal procedures that required warrants, coordination with local authorities, and protocols that would give the targets weeks of advance warning. The hunting network would scatter long before official law enforcement could act, taking their operation to a new location where the cycle would begin again. "Send me everything you have," Sarah said, making the decision that would define the rest of her unofficial career. Intelligence reports, satellite imagery, personnel files, communication intercepts. "I'll handle this through unofficial channels." "Are you sure?" Santos asked, though relief was obvious in her voice. "This isn't a small group of criminals with hunting rifles. These people have military equipment, professional training, and defensive positions that would challenge a full tactical team." "Then, it's a good thing I brought experience with asymmetric warfare," Sarah replied, already reviewing the preliminary intelligence that Santos was transmitting. "Sometimes the best way to fight a superior force is to make them think they're hunting you while you're actually hunting them." The compound sat on 5,000 acres of forested mountains, accessible only by a single road that was monitored by cameras and guards. Intelligence suggested defensive positions around the perimeter, patrol routes that covered approaches from any direction, and communications equipment that could coordinate response to any threat. The buildings included barracks for operatives, guest quarters for clients, and holding facilities for victims who would be released as prey during hunting events. Sarah spent 2 weeks conducting reconnaissance that demonstrated why Special Operations Forces were specifically trained for missions that conventional military units couldn't accomplish. She approached the compound through terrain that the defenders considered impassable, moving during weather conditions that grounded their surveillance drones, and using camouflage techniques that made her invisible to guards who were scanning for obvious threats. The intelligence she gathered revealed the full scope of what was being planned. 26 victims had already been kidnapped from hiking trails across the western United States, families, couples, and solo travelers who had disappeared without trace. They were being held in underground facilities that had been constructed specifically for this purpose, waiting to be released as prey for clients who were arriving from around the world. More disturbing was the client list Sarah discovered during electronic surveillance of the compound's communications. Wealthy individuals from multiple countries had paid between $50,000 and $200,000 for the opportunity to hunt human beings with high-powered rifles and professional guides. The event was being marketed as the ultimate adrenaline experience for people who had exhausted legal forms of dangerous recreation. Sarah's military training had prepared her to deal with enemies who threatened national security, but this was different. These were civilians, including children, who had been kidnapped specifically to be murdered for entertainment. The moral weight of their situation eliminated any consideration of waiting for official law enforcement response. On the night before the hunting event was scheduled to begin, Sarah initiated an operation that combined every skill learned through years of special operations training with improvisational tactics designed specifically for the terrain and situation she faced. The compound's defenders were expecting potential law enforcement response, but they had no experience dealing with a single operative who could function as an entire tactical unit. Sarah began with the communications infrastructure, using electronic warfare techniques to disable the compound's ability to coordinate defensive response or summon external assistance. She systematically eliminated surveillance cameras and motion sensors while remaining invisible to guards who were scanning for obvious threats. Within 2 hours, the defenders had been rendered blind and deaf without realizing they were under attack. The first guards never knew what hit them. Sarah moved through their positions like smoke, using non-lethal techniques that left them unconscious but alive, secured with their own equipment, and hidden where they wouldn't be discovered until the operation was complete. She eliminated perimeter security one position at a time, creating gaps in their defensive coverage that would allow access to the main buildings. The guest quarters were Sarah's first priority. The wealthy clients who had paid to hunt human beings were sleeping peacefully in luxury accommodations, expecting to begin their entertainment the next morning. Sarah moved through the building like a force of nature, securing each room with zip ties and medical tape that left the would-be hunters helpless but breathing. Their expensive hunting rifles were collected and secured, eliminating the weapons that would have been used to murder innocent people. "What's happening?" One of the clients demanded when he regained consciousness to find himself restrained in his own bed. "Who are you? Do you know how much money I paid to be here?" "I'm someone who hunts hunters," Sarah replied, her voice carrying the kind of authority that made further questions unnecessary. "You paid money to murder innocent people. Now you get to experience what it feels like to be helpless prey." The client tried to threaten her with connections and consequences, but Sarah was already moving to the next room. Within an hour, 12 wealthy psychopaths were secured and waiting for law enforcement that would arrive with evidence of conspiracy to commit murder across state lines. Their hunting vacation had become a lesson in what happened when predators encountered someone more dangerous than themselves. The operational headquarters presented greater challenges. 20 armed guards and network leadership were coordinating defensive response while trying to determine what had happened to their perimeter security. Sarah could hear radio communications becoming increasingly frantic as teams failed to report in, and surveillance systems revealed nothing but empty positions where guards should have been standing. "We're under attack," the network leader was saying over intercepted communications. "Professional operation, probably federal tactical team. Implement lockdown protocols and prepare defensive positions." Sarah smiled at their assumption. A federal tactical team would approach with overwhelming force, air support, and coordinated assault from multiple directions. Sarah was implementing something much more personal, a hunter stalking prey that had forgotten what it felt like to be hunted by someone more skilled than themselves. The psychological warfare began with evidence that their security had been completely compromised. Sarah left unconscious guards in positions where they would be discovered, arranged their weapons in patterns that suggested overwhelming force, and created the impression of a much larger attacking force by striking simultaneously at locations that should have been impossible to reach. "How many are we facing?" one of the guards asked over radio, scanning darkness that revealed nothing despite extensive night vision equipment. "Unknown," came the reply from their leader, whose confidence was rapidly being replaced by growing fear. "Could be an entire platoon. Maintain positions and wait for reinforcement." No reinforcement was coming. Sarah had eliminated their communications with the outside world, while law enforcement agencies coordinated their official response to intelligence that would arrive at exactly the right moment. The network was trapped in their own compound, facing an enemy they couldn't see or count, while their victims waited in underground holding facilities that Sarah was systematically approaching. The rescue operation demonstrated why hostage recovery required specialized training that went beyond normal law enforcement capabilities. Sarah located the underground prison through intelligence gathered during reconnaissance, accessed it through ventilation systems that the builders hadn't properly secured, and neutralized guards who were supposed to prevent exactly this kind of infiltration. 26 kidnapped hikers were freed from conditions that would have given them nightmares for the rest of their lives. Families who had been separated were reunited. Couples who thought they would never see each other again embraced in corridors that had been designed as the final place they would ever see. Sarah led them through escape routes that avoided the ongoing firefight above ground, moving them to safety while the compound's defenders tried to coordinate response to an attack they still couldn't understand. "How did you find us?" asked Jennifer Walsh, a teacher from Oregon who had been kidnapped while hiking with her teenage daughter 3 weeks earlier. "Someone told me people were hunting other people for sport," Sarah replied, leading the rescued victims through terrain that would take them safely away from the compound. "I don't allow that." The final confrontation came when Sarah returned to finish eliminating the threat posed by the network's leadership. The remaining guards had fortified themselves in the main building, using their knowledge of the compound's layout to create defensive positions that would challenge any conventional assault. They were armed with military-grade weapons and had established overlapping fields of fire that covered all obvious approaches. Sarah approached through a route they hadn't considered. The building's own construction provided access points that could be exploited by someone with her training. She moved through infrastructure spaces that connected different sections, emerging in their defensive perimeter like materialized darkness that struck before disappearing again. "Where is she?" the network leader demanded over radio, his professional composure beginning to crack under psychological pressure that was destroying his team's morale. "How is one person doing this?" "Professional operator," one of his guards replied, the same recognition Sarah had heard before from criminals who were finally understanding what they faced. Special operations background. Probably SEAL team training. Then, we fight like it. The leader responded, making the tactical error that would seal his fate. Full military response. Use everything we have. The compound erupted in gunfire directed at shadows and sounds while Sarah remained invisible in darkness that had become her primary weapon. The guards revealed their positions and ammunition status while hitting nothing but their own infrastructure. Fear was replacing tactical discipline as they realized their expensive defensive positions were being systematically neutralized by someone who treated their fortifications as minor obstacles. One by one, the guards fell to non-lethal techniques that left them unconscious but alive. Sarah moved through their positions like flowing water, appearing long enough to eliminate threats before disappearing into terrain that provided unlimited concealment options. The network's leadership found themselves alone and defenseless in a building that had become their prison rather than their fortress. "I surrender," the network leader called when he realized his entire force had been eliminated by a single operator. "I'll tell you everything. Names, locations, bank accounts, client lists." "You'll tell law enforcement everything," Sarah corrected, securing him with the same zip ties that held his subordinates. "I'm just here to make sure you survive long enough to face justice." The leader tried to bargain with information about other networks and criminal organizations, but Sarah was already coordinating with federal agents who were arriving to collect evidence and prisoners. Her job was elimination of immediate threats, not gathering intelligence for prosecution purposes that would take years to complete. As dawn broke over the compound, Sarah surveyed the results of an operation that had freed 26 kidnapped victims and neutralized the largest human hunting network ever discovered. 43 criminals were secured and waiting for law enforcement, including wealthy clients who would face charges for conspiracy to commit murder. The compound contained enough evidence to destroy similar networks operating in other locations. Agent Santos arrived with the federal response team, shaking her head in amazement at the scope of what had been accomplished by a single operator working through unofficial channels. "How do we explain this in official reports?" she asked, looking at evidence that would fill warehouses and prisoners that would require multiple transportation vehicles. "Anonymous tip led to discovery of criminal network," Sarah suggested, already preparing to disappear before official questions began. Federal agents responded appropriately and rescued kidnapped victims before they could be harmed. Santos smiled at the simplification that would protect Sarah while ensuring the criminals faced prosecution. The truth about who had actually eliminated the threat would remain classified, but the results spoke for themselves. 26 innocent people were alive because someone had been willing to fight predators on their own terms. Sarah left the compound as quietly as she had arrived, moving through terrain that would take her to extraction points where she could disappear completely. Her war against wilderness predators was far from over. Intelligence gathered during the operation had revealed networks operating in other countries where local law enforcement lacked the capability to respond effectively. But this victory felt different from her previous operations. She hadn't just stopped criminals from committing future crimes. She had rescued innocent people who were about to be murdered for entertainment. The families reunited in those underground corridors would go home to lives that continued because someone had decided that human hunting was unacceptable under any circumstances. Sarah's satellite phone contained new assignments from federal agencies who had recognized the effectiveness of unofficial operations conducted by someone with her specific skills. Other networks were operating in wilderness areas across North America, marketing human hunting experiences to wealthy clients who thought money could buy them the right to murder innocent people. Each assignment would be different, requiring new tactics and adaptation to terrain and situations that challenged every aspect of her training. But the core mission remained constant, protecting innocent people from predators who used wilderness areas as hunting grounds where they thought they could operate without interference. Sarah disappeared into the Montana wilderness, moving toward her next assignment with the satisfaction that came from successful completion of a mission that had saved lives while eliminating threats to public safety. She had found her calling in retirement from the Navy SEALs, hunting hunters who had forgotten that they weren't the only predators in the wilderness. Some people thought money and weapons made them untouchable. Others knew that real predators didn't need either to be the most dangerous thing in any environment. The mountains were peaceful again, but somewhere else, other predators were discovering what happened when they tried to hunt someone who had been trained by the world's most elite military unit to treat any situation as a battlefield where victory was the only acceptable outcome. Navy SEALs never truly stopped serving. They just found new enemies who needed to learn the same lessons about what happened when ordinary people were threatened by those who thought themselves untouchable. The hunt was eternal, but so was the determination to protect those who couldn't protect themselves from predators who had made the fatal mistake of believing that wilderness was a place where laws didn't apply and consequences never arrived. Sarah's war against human hunters would continue until every network was dismantled and every predator understood that some prey fought back with skills that turned hunters into the hunted. The wilderness belonged to everyone, not just those who thought they could use it as their personal killing ground. That lesson would be taught as many times as necessary, to as many predators as required, until the message became clear to everyone who thought innocent people were acceptable prey. The hunt never ended, but neither did the hunter. Recognizing that they had been taught by someone whose background went far beyond normal survival training. They had faced genuine danger and survived because they had been led by someone who treated protection of innocent people as a professional responsibility that didn't end with retirement from military service. As dawn approached, Sarah watched law enforcement helicopters arriving to collect criminals and evidence. Her students were safe, the immediate threat had been neutralized, and another group of predators would face justice for crimes that had gone unpunished too long. The wilderness was beautiful in morning light, and Sarah felt the same sense of completion that had followed successful operations during her military career. But this time was different. She wasn't completing a mission assigned by commanding officers. She was protecting people who had trusted her with their safety during what should have been a peaceful learning experience. The responsibility felt different, more personal, and somehow more important than following orders in military operations. Sarah realized she had found her new calling. Teaching wilderness survival was rewarding, but using those skills to protect innocent people from human predators felt like the natural evolution of her military service. Some threats required law enforcement response, but others needed the kind of direct action that only special operations training could provide. The mountains were peaceful again, but Sarah knew other predators were operating in other wilderness areas, hunting people who had no idea they were walking into carefully prepared traps. Her satellite phone contained contact information for federal agencies who were coordinating investigations across multiple states, and they would need someone with her specific skills to deal with threats that law enforcement couldn't handle through traditional methods. Sarah's hiking vacation had become a counter-terrorism operation. Her wilderness survival classes had become tactical training for potential victims. Her retirement from the Navy SEALs had become a transition to a different kind of service, one where she could choose her own missions and protect people who needed someone willing to fight predators on their own terms. The academy would need a new instructor because Sarah had just received an unofficial assignment that would take her to wilderness areas across the country where human hunters were operating beyond the reach of traditional law enforcement. Some problems required conventional solutions, but others needed someone who could hunt the hunters with skills they had never encountered and determination they couldn't match. Navy SEALs never truly retired. They just found new ways to serve. Suit. The man crashed through undergrowth like a frightened animal, making enough noise to be tracked from half a mile away. His panicked flight led him deeper into wilderness where no help would arrive, away from trails, and toward terrain that would become increasingly difficult to navigate in darkness. The hunt that followed demonstrated the difference between someone who used wilderness for recreation and someone who had been trained to treat any environment as an operational theater. Sarah moved through forests that slowed the fleeing criminal to a stumbling walk, maintaining contact while remaining invisible. She herded him away from potential escape routes and toward areas where capture would be inevitable. When the leader finally collapsed from exhaustion beside a steep ravine, Sarah was waiting in the shadows above him. He lay gasping in pine needles, his expensive tactical gear torn by branches he hadn't seen in darkness, his confidence replaced by the exhausted terror of prey that had been run to ground by a superior predator. "Please," he whispered when Sarah appeared beside him. Her approach, so quiet he hadn't heard her coming despite listening desperately for pursuit. "I'll do anything. Money, information, whatever you want." "I want you to understand something," Sarah replied, securing his wrists with the same zip ties that held his companions. "Every innocent person you terrorized felt exactly what you're feeling right now. The difference is they didn't deserve it." The leader tried to speak, to bargain or threaten, but Sarah was already moving him back toward the camp where his accomplices waited under guard. The night's work was nearly finished, and morning would bring law enforcement to collect criminals who had thought themselves untouchable in wilderness areas where they had previously operated without interference. As dawn approached, Sarah surveyed 4 secured criminals and a substantial amount of evidence that would connect them to multiple unsolved disappearances in wilderness areas across several states. She had turned a relaxing hiking trip into a counter-terrorism operation, using skills she had hoped to leave behind but had needed one final time. The satellite communicator in her pack, military-grade equipment the criminals hadn't known to look for, connected her to law enforcement agencies who would coordinate the recovery of both criminals and evidence. Sarah's report would be thorough and professional, detailing crimes discovered and actions taken to prevent further victims. But first, she would complete her hike as planned, continuing through wilderness that had been purged of a very human danger. The mountains were beautiful in morning light, and for the first time since beginning her transition to civilian life, Sarah felt truly at peace with the skills that had defined her military career. Some predators hunted innocent people for sport. Others hunted predators for justice. The mountains didn't care about the difference, but the families of future victims certainly would.